the Browning M2 50 caliber machine gun undeniably stood as the most destructive infantry weapon deployed by the United States during the Second World War. When firmly affixed to a stationary tripod, a proficient marksman possessed the capability to penetrate engine blocks from a distance of 800 yards, lacerate aircraft fuselages at 1,000 yards, and unleash a torrent of 450 rounds per minute with terrifying accuracy. However, attaching this formidable weapon to the pedestal mount of a Willys MB Jeep hurtling along a deeply rutted Philippine supply route at 40 miles per hour transformed it into an unwieldy 700-pound impediment, incapable of striking even a large target from close range. The inherent flaw was not with the weapon itself. The M2 had demonstrably proven its mettle across all combat theaters, from the arid landscapes of North Africa to the snow-laden forests of the Ardennes. The true impediment lay within the mount, specifically the M31C pedestal, a 32-pound steel post directly welded into a socket on the Jeep's frame, positioned just behind the passenger seat. The theoretical advantage of this configuration was to provide American reconnaissance units with potent mobile firepower. In practical application, however, it resulted in a weapon system that vibrated violently, rattled incessantly, and discharged rounds in a wide, conical pattern, approximately 15 degrees in width, the very instant the driver engaged the accelerator. Envision a gunner attempting to brace himself in the rear of a Jeep, careening down a treacherous jungle path in March 1945. The M31C pedestal offered absolutely no absorption of vibration. Every jarring impact from a pothole, every subtle tremor from the engine, every minute steering correction made by the driver was directly transmitted through the rigid steel post into the gun's receiver. Furthermore, the Browning says reciprocating bolt, a substantial 17-pound steel block hurtling back and forth 13 times per second, generated its own distinct harmonic frequency. The confluence of this internal mechanical violence with the external shocks from the road created a weapon system utterly incapable of maintaining a stable sight picture for more than a fleeting half-second. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. The official Army Technical Manual 9115213 disseminated in February 1943, conceded this significant operational drawback in a mere 3 sentences, somewhat obscured on page 127. A decline in accuracy is anticipated during vehicle movement. Gunners are advised to engage targets from stationary positions whenever feasible. Sustained fire while mobile is not recommended for precision engagement. In essence, this passage translated to, your vehicle-mounted machine gun serves primarily as a decorative element unless the Jeep is brought to a complete halt beforehand. This was far from a minor inconvenience. By early 1945, American forces operating in the Pacific were engaged in swift, mechanized patrols through Japanese-occupied territories, where pausing for even a moment could prove fatal. Convoys urgently required suppressive fire on the move to sweep tree lines, strike bunker apertures, and compel enemy personnel to remain concealed while the column advanced through treacherous ambush zones. A weapon that demanded a full vehicle stop prior to engagement was not merely unhelpful, it was a tactically suicidal proposition. Gunnery Sergeant William Mercer, attached to the 1st Cavalry Division's reconnaissance platoon on Luzon, meticulously documented the profound frustration in his after-action report, dated February 12, 1945, engaged enemy machine gun position at approximately 200 yards while vehicle in motion. Expended 87 rounds, 0 observed hits, vehicle halted, engaged same target stationary, neutralized position with 23 rounds. The statistical evidence was damning. Nearly 4 times the amount of ammunition was squandered, and only by immobilizing the vehicle did the weapon achieve any measure of effectiveness. The United States Marine Corps encountered identical difficulties in both the Philippines and Okinawa. Their jeep-mounted .50 caliber machine guns could indeed instill fear, generate considerable noise, and force enemy infantry to take cover, but they consistently failed to inflict reliable casualties while in motion. In the context of island-hopping campaigns, where every incremental yard of advance exacted a heavy toll in lives, an inaccurate support weapon was not merely aggravating, it constituted a grave dereliction of duty. Staff Sergeant Raymond Cupp was not an engineer by profession. He had never matriculated at an ordnance school, nor had he delved into the intricacies of mechanical design or even perused a physics textbook beyond his high school curriculum. He was a humble farm boy, originating from the environs of Terre Haute, Indiana, who had dedicated his adolescent years to mending tractor suspensions and ingeniously improvising plow hitches when his father's financial constraints precluded the purchase of replacements. This practical background in agricultural ingenuity was poised to resolve a perplexing issue that had eluded the expertise of Army Ordnance Corps professionals for a span of 2 years. Cupp arrived in the Philippines with the 37th Infantry Division in January 1945, assigned the role of a gunner on a reconnaissance jeep. Within his initial week of patrol duty north of Manila, he had expended a staggering 1,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition and, by his own candid admission, had failed to strike anything he had aimed at. This frustrating experience deeply troubled him. Back in Indiana, he could navigate his father's farmall tractor across a freshly plowed field and maintain a surveying rod steadfastly in its makeshift rear mount. Why, he pondered, could the Army not achieve similar stability for a machine gun on a platform specifically designed for weaponry? The revelation dawned upon him on February 23, 1945, as he observed a Sherman tank crew meticulously working on their suspension system. The tank's bogie wheels, which are the road wheels that directly contact the ground, were each mounted on independent vertical coil suspensions. These substantial coils were engineered to absorb impacts and dampen vibrations before they could propagate to the main hull. Cupp intently studied these springs for approximately 20 minutes, then returned to his jeep and regarded the M31C pedestal with a newfound perspective. The pedestal was inherently rigid, completely unforgivingly rigid. It directly transferred every iota of kinetic energy from the road into the weapon system. What if, he mused, it wasn't? Cupp dedicated the subsequent 4 days to diligently scavenging for necessary materials. He procured 2 robust compression springs from the seat assembly of a wrecked 2.5-ton truck, each spring rated to handle approximately 200 pounds of vertical load. He then requisitioned a 5-foot section of half-inch steel pipe from a combat engineer unit, fabricating a plausible excuse that he required it for tent-pole repairs. In a resourceful transaction, he bartered 2 cartons of Lucky Strike cigarettes to a Navy CB welder for an hour of acetylene torch time. Finally, he borrowed, without explicit permission, a sheet of 1/4-inch steel plate from a supply depot's inventory of damaged goods. The resulting design was remarkably elegant in its simplicity. Cupp meticulously cut the steel pipe into 4 distinct sections and welded them vertically around the base of the M31C pedestal, thereby fashioning a square protective cage. The lower end of each pipe section was securely welded to a steel plate, which in turn was bolted directly to the Jeep's frame. The upper end of each pipe section was welded to a second steel plate, which served to support the pedestal itself. Between these 2 plates, nestled within each pipe section, Cupp ingeniously installed one of the salvaged compression springs. Consequently, the pedestal now floated on 4 spring-loaded columns instead of being rigidly affixed to the frame. The underlying physics were more akin to agricultural engineering than military science. Cupp had essentially engineered a colossal shock absorber, employing the very same principle as his tractor's spring-mounted seat, to effectively isolate the operational component from the source of vibration. Road shocks would compress the springs, which would then rebound to their neutral position, thereby converting sharp, jarring impacts into a smoother, more dampened motion. The MPH's inherent recoil would still occur, but the newly spring-mounted platform would absorb a significant portion of that energy, preventing it from feeding back into the vehicle frame and creating a detrimental feedback loop. On March 1, 1945, Cupp conducted a test firing of his modified mount on a stationary Jeep. The weapon functioned flawlessly. The springs compressed slightly with each burst of fire, then resiliently returned to their original state. There were no discernible structural failures. That very afternoon, he successfully persuaded his squad leader, Sergeant First Class Jack Delaney, to permit him to test-fire the weapon while the Jeep was in motion. They embarked on a half-mile circuit through an abandoned sugarcane field at a speed of 30 mph, during which Cupp discharged controlled bursts at a predetermined tree. The resulting grouping was not perfect, yet it was undeniably achievable. For the very first time, a gunner could observe his tracers accurately progressing toward the target rather than erratically spiraling into random arcs. Delaney brought the Jeep to a halt, walked to the marked tree, and meticulously counted 17 impacts within a 2-foot circle at a distance of 150 yards. He then turned back to Cupp, his expression a remarkable blend of profound amazement and stark horror. "That thing's not regulation," he declared. "We're using it anyway." The efficacy of Cupp's ingenious modification, and conversely the inherent failure of the Army's standard mount, can be attributed to a phenomenon known as resonant frequency amplification. While no one within the 37th Infantry Division would have employed such precise terminology, this is precisely what transpired within that Jeep each time a gunner engaged the trigger while the vehicle was in motion. The Browning M2's bolt assembly, weighing 17 pounds, traverses approximately 6 inches backward with every shot, cycling at an approximate rate of 450 rounds per minute in sustained fire mode. This translates to 7.5 cycles per second, or a frequency of 7.5 Hz. Concurrently, a Willys MB Jeep traveling at 40 mph over typical Philippine roadways generated vertical frame oscillations ranging between 8 and 12 Hz, contingent upon the prevailing road conditions. The most severe resonance typically occurred around 9.5 Hz, particularly when encountering regularly spaced ruts or washboard surfaces. When 2 distinct vibration sources operate at similar frequencies within a rigidly connected system, they do not cancel each other out, instead they mutually amplify one another. This principle is precisely what causes wine glasses to shatter when a soprano vocalizes the correct resonant note. The Jeep's frame vibration and the gun's recoil vibration were sufficiently close in frequency that they produced constructive interference, thereby exacerbating the total movement far beyond what either source would have generated independently. An engineering study conducted at Aberdeen, proving ground. In November 1943, a full 9 months before Cupp even deployed overseas, had definitively identified this precise issue in its test report, which was marked for internal review only. The report specifically recommended the implementation of a vibration isolation mount, incorporating elastic dampening elements with a natural frequency below 4 Hz to effectively prevent harmonic coupling. Nevertheless, this crucial recommendation remained unacted upon, languishing in a filing cabinet, primarily because implementing such a solution would have necessitated a complete retooling of production at 23 different ordnance facilities. The innovative springs fashioned by Staff Sergeant Cupp possessed a natural frequency of approximately 3.2 Hz, a characteristic precisely aligned with the specifications outlined by Aberdeen's engineering experts, determined by their physical dimensions and the weight they bore. Remarkably, Cupp did not arrive at this figure through complex computations. Instead, his practical experience informed him that the comfort of tractor seats in uneven agricultural terrain necessitated compliant springs, a principle he instinctively applied to his gunner's platform for an identical purpose, mitigating jarring movements. Beyond this initial design insight, the subsequent critical challenge involved effectively managing the weapon's recoil. The formidable M2 machine gun unleashes an estimated 2,800 foot-pounds of recoil energy with each discharge. Under the conventional M31C pedestal mount, this entire force was directly transferred to the Jeep's chassis, which, due to its inflexible connection, then channeled the energy back into the weapon itself, establishing a detrimental feedback loop. During a rapid 5-round burst, the weapon would already be experiencing significant oscillation by the third shot, a direct consequence of the initial recoil reverberating back through the vehicle's structure. By the time the 5th round was fired, 3 distinct recoil waves were actively interfering, rendering the gunner's sight picture so chaotic it resembled peering into a vigorously agitated paint mixer. In contrast, Cupp's innovative spring-based mount effectively absorbed approximately 40% of this destructive recoil energy. This absorption occurred through the cyclical compression and expansion of the springs, with the energy transforming into heat within the spring metal rather than being reflected back into the weapon. This phenomenon is scientifically termed hysteretic damping, a principle fundamental to the superior ride quality provided by automotive suspension systems. While the residual 60% of the recoil energy still imparted movement to the weapon, the absence of the amplifying feedback mechanism rendered it significantly more controllable. The weapon would gently rock backward on its springs, quickly regain its stability, and be prepared for the subsequent discharge, rather than remaining in a state of disruptive vibration from the preceding shot. A crucial yet often overlooked third dimension to this innovation was the profound impact on the human operator. When a gunner was forced to brace against a rigidly fixed weapon mount, their musculature constantly battled against every incoming vibration, inadvertently introducing further unpredictable movements into their aiming. Conversely, Cupp's ingenious floating mount significantly reduced the need for strenuous muscular compensation as the springs adeptly absorbed and managed the broader movements of the weapon. This allowed the gunner to concentrate invaluable mental and physical effort on precise aim adjustments, rather than engaging in a ceaseless struggle to control the weapon itself. Decades subsequent to Kupp's wartime improvisation, extensive evaluations performed at the Army Research Laboratory scientifically validated this observation, demonstrating that spring-isolated weapon systems exhibited a remarkable 35% reduction in gunner-induced movement when compared to their rigidly mounted counterparts, primarily because the operator was no longer engaged in continuous, fatiguing overcorrection. The inherent irony of the situation lay in the fact that Kupp's foundational design principle was not, in essence, entirely novel. Historical records indicate that the French military had explored spring-isolated machine gun mounts as far back as 1918, and German forces incorporated rubber isolation bushings into certain aircraft-mounted weapons. However, the continuity of institutional knowledge frequently falters across different conflicts or distinct military branches. Consequently, by 1945, the prevailing consensus within the American Army held that rigid mounts intrinsically offered superior stability. Staff Sergeant Kupp, through his practical innovation, definitively demonstrated that true stability is not synonymous with absolute rigidity. Indeed, the most stable platform is often one that is engineered with the capacity for controlled movement. After 2 or 3 paragraphs, ask us to stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. The inaugural combat deployment of Kupp's ingeniously modified mount occurred on March 8, 1945, amidst a critical reconnaissance sweep unfolding to the east of San Fernando. Kupp's squad occupied the 3rd position within a 5-jeep convoy traversing a dense coconut plantation, when suddenly concealed Japanese infantry unleashed a barrage of fire from a position approximately 200 yards to their left flank. Conventional military doctrine would have dictated an immediate halt to the convoy, followed by dismounting personnel to engage the enemy. However, the astute column commander, First Lieutenant Anthony Brussia, made a decisive and unconventional tactical decision. He issued orders for the jeeps to sustain their speed, simultaneously returning suppressive fire as they navigated through the perilous kill zone. Notably, Kupp's jeep was the sole vehicle within the entire column equipped with the innovative modified mount. The gunners in the other 4 jeeps, utilizing their conventional M31C pedestals, unleashed prolonged bursts of fire that indiscriminately shredded palm fronds, churned up the soil, but ultimately achieved little in terms of effective engagement. In stark contrast, Kupp discharged 3 precisely controlled bursts, totaling 22 rounds, successfully placing 8 of those rounds directly into the enemy position's frontal cover. This accurate fire resulted in the immediate demise of 2 Japanese soldiers, compelling the remaining enemy combatants to withdraw before the convoy had fully exited the ambush zone. Remarkably, there were 0 American casualties during this engagement. Lieutenant Brussia promptly submitted his after-action report that very evening. The pertinent section of his report unequivocally stated, Staff Sergeant Kupp's modified weapon mount demonstrated marked improvement in accuracy during mobile engagement. Request ordnance evaluation for possible wider implementation. This commendation and request for further assessment was forwarded to Captain Leonard Hartman, the ordnance officer for the 37th Infantry Division, who, on March 11th, personally traveled to inspect Cupp's modified Jeep. Hartman's reaction was both instantaneous and entirely foreseeable, steeped in adherence to established protocol. He promptly declared that the innovative modification contravened no less than 3 distinct sections of Army Regulation 758, which strictly governed unauthorized alterations to officially issued equipment. Consequently, he issued a direct order for the immediate removal of the springs and the restoration of the mount to its original, standard configuration. However, Cupp's resolute squad leader, Sergeant Delaney, dismissively instructed Hartman to proceed with whatever bureaucratic paperwork he deemed necessary, while pointedly ensuring the springs remained precisely in place. This seemingly defiant act was not in its essence a pure case of insubordination. Rather, it represented the profound, unspoken understanding that frequently existed between battle-hardened frontline soldiers and their more remotely positioned rear echelon officers. Captain Hartman was at liberty to compose any official reports he desired. Nonetheless, Sergeant Delaney's men would continue to utilize any and all equipment that demonstrably preserved their lives. Thus, the springs remained firmly installed. The informal dissemination of this crucial information outpaced the sluggish pace of official communication channels by a considerable margin. By the closing days of March, an additional 3 reconnaissance units within the 37th Division had independently fabricated their own renditions of Cupp's innovative mount, resourcefully employing whatever scavenged materials were available. The renowned 1st Cavalry Division, stationed approximately 30 miles to the north, acquired knowledge of this development through the robust, informal grapevine, and promptly dispatched a warrant officer to thoroughly inspect Cupp's Jeep. This officer meticulously recorded precise measurements, captured detailed photographs, and even secured a sample of the spring mechanism to bring back to his unit's motor pool for replication. Astoundingly, within a mere 10-day period, the 1st Cavalry Division successfully outfitted 6 of its Jeeps with strikingly similar field-expedient modifications. The initial verifiable quantitative combat data concerning these modified mounts emerged from the 7th Infantry Division on Okinawa during April 1945. Major Douglas Sinclair, who commanded a mechanized reconnaissance company, had granted his gunners permission to construct Cupp-style mounts after receiving first-hand accounts from a sergeant who had recently transferred to his unit. Major Sinclair, known for his meticulous record-keeping, maintained precise logs detailing ammunition expenditure, juxtaposed against confirmed enemy kills, information he had diligently gathered since January to substantiate his ongoing requests for increased allocations of .50 caliber ammunition. The resulting statistical figures were undeniably stark and compelling. Between April the 12th and April 28th, his company actively engaged 23 distinct targets, while their vehicles were in constant motion. Jeeps equipped with the standard unmodified mounts required an average of 187 rounds expended to achieve a single confirmed enemy casualty. In stark contrast, Jeeps fitted with the modified mounts achieved a confirmed casualty with an average of only 44 rounds per casualty, representing a staggering 76% enhancement in ammunition efficiency, a metric that directly correlated to significantly improved combat effectiveness. Furthermore, Major Sinclair's comprehensive report incorporated an even more invaluable component, direct testimony from the gunners themselves. Corporal Edwin Marsh, for instance, eloquently penned, "Can actually see where rounds are going now. can walk fire onto target instead of just hoping something connects, makes you feel like you're doing your job instead of making noise. This concluding sentiment held particular significance. True combat effectiveness extends beyond mere mechanical performance. It is inextricably linked to the confidence of the individual soldier. Gunners operating the modified mounts consistently reported a heightened sense of capability, which in turn fostered greater aggression during engagements, ultimately culminating in superior overall effectiveness. By May 1945, the widespread adoption of these modified mounts had extended to a minimum of 17 distinct units dispersed across the islands of Luzon, Okinawa, and Mindanao. This proliferation occurred entirely through informal communication networks, with soldiers diligently constructing replicas based solely on verbal descriptions relayed by comrades who had witnessed the original innovation. Despite the demonstrable combat advantages, the official stance of the Army steadfastly maintained that such field modifications were both unauthorized and inherently perilous. Concurrently, however, authenticated combat reports unequivocally indicated that Cup's technically illegal mount was contributing significantly to the preservation of lives and the conservation of precious ammunition, seemingly in equal proportions. Given this pronounced divergence between official policy and operational reality, a direct collision with bureaucratic authority was utterly inevitable. This impending collision manifested dramatically on May 19, 1945, with the urgent arrival of a priority telegram at the headquarters of General Walter Kruger's 6th Army. The dispatch, originating from the office of the Chief of Ordnance in Washington and relayed via Manila, was conspicuously terse and direct, a tone uncharacteristic of typical official correspondence. It sternly noted that numerous field units were reporting unauthorized modifications to the M31C pedestal mount, and the Ordnance Department demanded an immediate cessation of these alterations, pending a comprehensive safety evaluation. The telegram meticulously detailed concerns regarding potential liability issues, raised serious questions about the structural integrity of the modified mounts, and warned of the distinct possibility of catastrophic failure during prolonged periods of sustained fire. Its concluding instruction was a clear directive: identify the original source of these unauthorized modifications and proceed to confiscate all non-standard equipment without delay. This uncompromising directive placed General Kruger in an exceptionally difficult, indeed almost untenable, predicament. His troops were deeply embroiled in a grueling 2-month-long campaign to eradicate the persistent Japanese resistance across the Philippines, consuming ammunition at an alarming rate that already severely taxed existing supply lines. Simultaneously, his vital reconnaissance units, the very soldiers enduring the most perilous, ambush-laden patrol duties and facing the highest risk of casualties, were unequivocally reporting that Cup's modified mounts had, for the first time, rendered their weapons truly effective and functional. Now, headquarters in Washington was demanding that he remove these life-saving modifications and revert to standard equipment that every soldier and officer in the theater of operations recognized as woefully inadequate. In response, General Kruger employed a classic tactic of pragmatic commanders throughout military history. He deliberately stalled for time. On May 22nd, he formally responded, stating that a comprehensive field evaluation of the reported modifications was actively underway, and that the removal of equipment during ongoing active combat operations posed an unacceptable operational risk. While this maneuver successfully purchased him precious time, it did not, by any means, resolve the fundamental dilemma. The Ordnance Department's insistence on safety testing was not inherently misplaced, indeed. It was a valid concern. Historically, unauthorized field modifications had tragically resulted in soldier fatalities when hastily improvised welds failed catastrophically or makeshift components shattered under the immense stress of combat. The critical question, therefore, revolved around whether stringent testing requirements should supersede the undeniable, life-saving data demonstrating enhanced combat effectiveness. Colonel Thomas Riss, who held the critical position of 6th Army's Chief Ordnance Officer, found himself in a particularly challenging predicament, caught between two fundamentally opposing yet equally valid imperatives. On one side, his professional obligations rigidly dictated the paramount importance of safeguarding equipment and rigorously upholding the standardization of the supply chain, concerns that were undeniably legitimate and central to military efficiency. However, confronting these established protocols was the compelling evidence he had gleaned from Major Sinclair's comprehensive Okinawa report, which strikingly revealed a 76% enhancement in ammunition efficiency, directly attributed to the modified mounts. Furthermore, his numerous conversations with frontline gunners provided powerful, first-hand validation, confirming that these redesigned weapon platforms were indeed superior in their operational effectiveness. Faced with this profound dichotomy, Colonel Riss, on May 28th, ingeniously put forth a pragmatic compromise to initiate an intensive, accelerated program of field testing. This would leverage the 6th Army's own substantial resources, meticulously document the ensuing results, and subsequently transmit a detailed set of recommendations to Washington. His proposal stipulated that if these expedited evaluations conclusively demonstrated the modifications to be both safe and genuinely effective, a concerted effort would be mounted to push for their official adoption. Conversely, should the tests unveil any significant problems or deficiencies, the modifications would be systematically rescinded, with the collected data providing an irrefutable justification for such a decision. The rigorous testing regimen was meticulously executed between June 2nd and June 15th, taking place at the expansive 6th Army Ordnance Depot, situated just outside Manila. A team of dedicated engineers meticulously prepared 3 Jeeps equipped with the innovative Cup-style modifications and 3 additional Jeeps fitted with the standard M31C pedestals. These vehicles were then subjected to an identical battery of demanding courses, during which comprehensive data was continuously recorded, encompassing crucial metrics such as accuracy, precise structural stress measurements, and any observable failure modes. The challenging course was designed to simulate a wide array of combat conditions, incorporating segments of smooth road firing, arduous rough terrain firing, extended sustained fire tests involving the continuous discharge of 200 rounds, and even extreme stress tests featuring deliberately introduced obstacles engineered to violently jolt the vehicle frames. The resultant findings were astonishingly conclusive, leaving no room for ambiguity. The modified mounts consistently demonstrated a remarkable 71% tighter shot grouping when operating at speeds exceeding 25 Mach, a performance metric almost perfectly mirroring Major Sinclair's earlier combat-derived statistics. Furthermore, an exhaustive structural analysis revealed an impressive absence of weld failures, no instances of spring fractures, and crucially, no frame stress levels that surpassed the parameters of normal operational limits. The solitary documented failure occurred when a test gunner, through deliberate action, excessively over-tightened the mount bolts, leading to a crack in the base plate, a clear instance of user error rather than an inherent design flaw. The engineer responsible for overseeing these critical evaluations, Captain Robert Yamaguchi, concluded his official report with a striking and unusual degree of directness, eschewing typical military circumlocution. His unequivocal pronouncement stated, "The modified mount is superior to standard equipment in every measurable category. Recommend immediate, theater-wide implementation." This forthright declaration underscored the compelling nature of the test results. On June 18th, Hendricks promptly transmitted Captain Yamaguchi's definitive report to Kruger, appending a concise cover memorandum that ardently advocated for the official authorization of the modification and formally requested Washington expedited approval for its widespread field production. Kruger, recognizing the undeniable advantages and the urgency of the situation, swiftly endorsed the recommendation, propelling it further up the hierarchical chain of command to General Douglas MacArthur's influential Southwest Pacific Command. After 2 or 3 paragraphs, ask us to stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Following this decisive endorsement, a period of protracted anticipation ensued as the crucial report began its slow, deliberate journey through the labyrinthine, bureaucratic channels, progressing at a pace aptly described as geological. In stark contrast to the glacial movement of official paperwork, soldiers across the theater continued their relentless efforts, actively fabricating and installing the modified mounts. By late June, this ingenious adaptation had transcended its initial adoption by reconnaissance units, organically spreading its influence to encompass military police convoys, forward artillery observers, and even resourceful tank destroyer crews who ingeniously reconfigured the underlying principle to enhance their .50 caliber coaxial mounts. The proverbial genie was unequivocally out of the bottle, its widespread acceptance now irreversible. Washington, in its distant authority, retained the theoretical power to either sanction it, prohibit it, or simply ignore its burgeoning presence. However, the undeniable reality on the ground was that these modified mounts were firmly entrenched and would not be disappearing, primarily because they consistently delivered superior performance, a fact deeply understood and implicitly trusted by every soldier who used them. The long-awaited official communication finally materialized on July 3, 1945, arriving a full 6 weeks after Kruger's initial submission and a significant 3 months subsequent to Kups's pioneering act of welding the very first prototype. The War Department, in its decree, authorized the provisional field adoption of the spring isolated pedestal mounts. This authorization, however, was contingent upon the completion of a formal design review and the subsequent development of comprehensive specifications. In layman's terms, while operational units were permitted to utilize these innovative mounts, they were explicitly cautioned not to anticipate any immediate or official supply chain support. This provisional endorsement by the War Department inadvertently spawned a uniquely bizarre and challenging logistical predicament. Units were granted permission to employ the modified mounts, yet the Army itself would neither undertake their manufacture nor issue any standardized installation instructions. nor provide any replacement parts. Consequently, every single spring isolated mount deployed across the vast expanse of the Pacific Theater had to be ingeniously fabricated locally, relying entirely on whatever disparate materials and specialized expertise individual units could manage to scrounge and assemble. For the dedicated ordnance companies and the pragmatic motor pool sergeants stationed throughout the Philippines and Okinawa, this monumental task effectively became the defining summer project of 1945. The 8th E6th Ordnance Company, strategically located at Tacloban, emerged as the pivotal entity in systematically organizing and standardizing this burgeoning production effort. Their astute commander, Major Harold Wexler, keenly grasped that while spontaneous battlefield improvisation served admirably for outfitting 1 or 2 jeeps, such ad hoc methods were utterly incapable of scaling to meet the demands of theater-wide implementation. Commencing in mid-July, Major Wexler's dedicated team embarked on an intensive process of reverse engineering CUP as original design, meticulously transforming it into a robust framework that closely resembled a formal production specification. Their exhaustive work involved precisely measuring spring rates, meticulously documenting optimal welding procedures, creating detailed dimensional drawings, and critically establishing comprehensive material substitution guidelines to be employed whenever ideal components proved unavailable. By July 28th, their diligence culminated in the production of a crucial 16-page mimeographed manual, aptly titled Provisional Modification Instructions, M31C Pedestal Mount Spring Isolated Configuration. This groundbreaking manual ingeniously reframed the pervasive issue of material scarcity, treating it not as an impediment or a bug, but rather as an inherent and integral design feature. For instance, if truck seat springs, the initial inspiration, were unattainable, the manual thoughtfully provided a comprehensive list of 6 viable alternative spring sources. These ranged from readily available aircraft landing gear components and robust 105mm howitzer recoil assemblies to, remarkably, even doubled-up bed frame springs. In situations where a qualified welder might be absent, the manual offered detailed brazing instructions, leveraging equipment commonly found in virtually any motor pool. Similarly, the specified steel pipe sections could be flexibly substituted with angle iron, square tubing, or, in dire necessity, even hard wood. However, the manual prudently cautioned that wooden mounts would necessitate replacement approximately every 6 weeks, due to the inevitable development of stress fractures. The dissemination of this vital information mirrored the organic spread of the initial modification, occurring through the same established informal networks. Motor pool sergeants, recognizing the immense value of these instructions, painstakingly copied the manual and diligently passed it along to adjacent units, fostering a grassroots information exchange. In a notable instance of dedicated resourcefulness, a chaplain en route to Okinawa thoughtfully carried a dozen copies secreted within his duffel bag, distributing them upon arrival to ordnance companies operating in that region. A single copy even journeyed to the 24th Infantry Division stationed in New Guinea, where a particularly resourceful lieutenant recognized its strategic importance, promptly produced an additional 30 copies, and ensured their wide distribution throughout his regiment. By early August, various iterations of this indispensable manual were known to exist in at least 40 distinct locations, scattered across the vast Pacific Theater, and the localized production of these vital mounts was actively underway, wherever individuals possessed access to a welder and a supply of scrap metal. The actual manufacturing processes exhibited a striking divergence in their level of sophistication and standardization. On one end of the spectrum, the 51st Ordnance Company on Luzon established an impressively efficient assembly line, capable of producing 4 complete mounts per day. This operation leveraged standardized jigs and employed dedicated skilled welders, achieving a remarkable degree of consistency where their manufactured mounts were practically interchangeable parts. In stark contrast, the 127th Infantry Regiment on Mindanao relied on the individual efforts of a single corporal whose welding skills were, by his own admission, marginal. He painstakingly constructed mounts one at a time, adapting each to whatever configuration he could manage with the materials immediately at hand. While his mounts certainly functioned as intended, no two were identical in appearance, and consequently, any replacement parts had to be custom fitted for each specific installation. Quality control measures were similarly improvised and varied widely. Some units, demonstrating a commendable commitment to safety and efficacy, conducted full test fire evaluations before officially declaring a mount operational. Others, under the immense pressures of combat and resource scarcity, simply bolted them on and fervently hoped for the best possible outcome. Inevitably, despite the ingenuity and dedication, some failures did manifest. Reports detailed springs that succumbed to cracking after merely 50 rounds of ammunition, welds that tragically separated under intense operational stress, and base plates that demonstrably bent when subjected to the jarring impacts of navigating exceptionally rough terrain. Nevertheless, the overall failure rate proved to be remarkably low, a testament to the inherent robustness of the design. This resilience was likely attributable to the mount's mechanical simplicity, coupled with the generous safety margins engineered into its components. For instance, a spring designed to capably handle a 200-pound load encountered no difficulty whatsoever in supporting a 60-pound gun and effectively absorbing its substantial recoil. Similarly, the welds securing the gun mount were subjected to stresses nowhere near their ultimate breaking point during typical operational use, contributing significantly to the system's overall reliability. By August 15, 1945, a date indelibly marked by Japan, formal announcement of surrender, the meticulous records of the 86th Ordnance Company indicated that an impressive 847 modified mounts had been successfully installed on jeeps across the vast expanse of the Pacific Theater. It is crucial to note that this figure represented only those units that had conscientiously reported their installations to the 86th. The actual cumulative total was, in all likelihood, considerably higher, probably nearing 1,200. Within a mere 6 months, this innovative modification had transformed from a single sergeant, as ingenious improvisation, into a pervasive, theater-wide equipment upgrade. This monumental achievement occurred entirely without the benefit of a single official procurement contract, without a solitary penny of dedicated funding, and remarkably, without formal approval, until the modification had already become an ubiquitous and indispensable part of the operational landscape. The profound irony of this situation was certainly not lost on the dedicated soldiers who were tirelessly performing the work. Corporal James Dietrich, a skilled welder assigned to the 542nd Ordnance, articulated this very sentiment in a poignant letter penned to his brother in August. He wrote, with a clear sense of both frustration, and pride. We are building gun mounts. The Army won. Pay for to fix a problem the Army says doesn't exist. And every gunner who gets one treats us like we invented fire. I've learned more about how the Army really works in 3 months than I did in 3 years of following regulations. This profound observation, capturing the essence of practical innovation overriding bureaucratic inertia, offered a lesson about the true mechanisms of military advancement that would ultimately prove far more enduring and impactful than the physical mounts themselves. The legacy of the spring isolated mount did not abruptly conclude with the cessation of hostilities in World War II, although its direct lineage became considerably more challenging to definitively trace once the intense period of active combat had subsided. A significant majority of the Jeep-mounted modifications were systematically stripped off during the inevitable post-war equipment turn-ins, subsequently welded apart for their scrap metal value, or regrettably simply abandoned in various motor pools scattered across the Pacific as units commenced their rotation homeward. The Army's official stance steadfastly maintained that these adaptations were merely provisional field expedients, not to be considered permanent or standard issue equipment. Nevertheless, the fundamental, underlying principle, the undeniable necessity for weapon platforms to incorporate vibration isolation mechanisms to preserve accuracy during vehicle movement, had been resoundingly proven under the most grueling and unforgiving combat conditions, circumstances that no amount of meticulously planned peacetime testing could ever hope to truly replicate. The first official, albeit belated, recognition of this critical principle finally arrived in 1948, when the Army at last issued Technical Bulletin TBR D984, tellingly titled Vibration Isolation for Vehicle-Mounted Crew-Served Weapons. Tucked away within the document, as appendices, was a design for a spring mount that bore an undeniably suspicious familiarity to anyone who had served in the Pacific Theater during the recent conflict. While certain aspects had been refined, the spring rates, for instance, were now precisely calculated by professional engineers rather than shrewdly estimated by a sergeant, and the materials were specified procurement items instead of scavenged components. The fundamental architectural brilliance remained unmistakably pure cup. It featured the essential 4 spring-loaded posts, ingeniously isolating the weapon mount from the detrimental vibrations of the vehicle frame. Conspicuously absent from the bulletin, however, was any mention of cup by name, any reference to the widespread wartime field modifications, or any acknowledgement whatsoever that thousands of soldiers had been effectively utilizing this exact solution for 3 years, while ordnance engineers purportedly developed it in the background. The Korean War marked a significant turning point, bringing this innovative principle into more widespread military application. The M38 Jeep, which succeeded the venerable wartime Willys MB, was offered with a factory-installed, spring-isolated 50 caliber machine gun mount, formerly known as the M66C. These production models incorporated advanced coil springs housed within sealed tubes, further enhanced by rubber bushings for supplementary damping. This design represented a considerable leap in sophistication compared to Sergeant Cup as improvised truck seat springs, yet it served precisely the same fundamental purpose: mitigating vibration. Gunnery manuals issued in 1951 explicitly highlighted that the M66C mount facilitated effective suppressive fire even while the vehicle was in motion, operating at speeds reaching 35 miles per hour. a critical capability that Cupp had ingeniously devised 6 years prior, and one that the Army had initially deemed unauthorized and impractical. The Vietnam War witnessed a further evolution of this concept with the emergence of specialized gun trucks. These were essentially standard cargo vehicles, specifically the two 1.2-ton M35s and the larger 5-ton M54s, which convoy security units meticulously armored and outfitted with multiple machine guns to safeguard vital supply routes. By 1968, the integration of spring isolation into the gun mounts on these formidable trucks had become standard practice, though the specific engineering designs exhibited considerable diversity, dictated by the individual units responsible for their fabrication. For instance, the gun trucks belonging to the 523rd Transportation Company utilized readily available automotive coil springs. In contrast, the 8th Transportation Group favored robust aircraft shock struts for their isolation systems. Meanwhile, the 39th Transportation Battalion engineered mounts incorporating rubber torsion elements ingeniously salvaged from helicopter landing gear. Time 2s. Despite these varied implementations, they all adhered to the identical foundational principle. It was imperative to isolate the weapon from the vehicle's inherent vibrations, or else resign oneself to drastically impaired accuracy. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Also, write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Intriguingly, formal military engineering consistently lagged behind practical field adaptations. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the official Army mounts for vehicle-mounted weapons largely retained rigid designs, offering only minimal vibration isolation. Consequently, soldiers persistently undertook their own modifications, employing springs, rubber bushings, and various improvised damping systems, because the standard issue equipment simply did not perform adequately under operational conditions. The profound institutional knowledge initially demonstrated by Cupp, the understanding that weapon mounts on moving platforms absolutely require isolation, was repeatedly rediscovered by each successive generation of soldiers grappling with the challenge of accurately engaging targets from mobile vehicles. The ultimate validation of this enduring principle arrived with the M153 Krauss, Common Remotely Operated Weapon Station, which began deployment on Humvees in 2007. Krauss represents a highly sophisticated computerized turret system, empowering gunners to precisely aim and fire weapons from the safety of the vehicle's interior, utilizing cameras and intuitive joystick controls. The advanced engineering underpinning Krauss encompasses complex gyroscopic stabilization, precise digital fire control, and all the cutting-edge technological advancements one would anticipate from 21st century military hardware. Yet, nestled within the system's intricate technical specifications lies its crucial mounting interface, a spring-isolated platform augmented with active damping mechanisms, specifically designed to prevent vehicle vibrations from compromising weapon accuracy. The fundamental principle that Cupp ingeniously welded together in a Philippine motor pool decades ago is now realized with servo motors and computerized stabilization, but its core purpose remains absolutely identical. Contemporary military engineers frequently assert that CREO's stabilization technology is derived from naval gun mounts and aircraft turret systems, which is technically accurate. However, if one meticulously traces the specific lineage of vehicle-mounted weapon isolation within the U.S. Army, the historical thread unmistakably leads back to reconnaissance jeeps in 1945 and to a resourceful sergeant who intuitively grasped that stable weapon platforms need not be rigidly fixed. Regrettably, Cupp never received formal accolades. His name never appeared in an official technical manual, and he likely remained unaware of the profound influence his improvised mount would exert on weapon system design for the subsequent 7 decades. Nevertheless, every gunner who has successfully engaged a target from a moving vehicle since 1945 inherently owes him a debt of gratitude, whether they consciously recognize it or not. Raymond Kupp's narrative is far from an isolated incident in military history. It embodies a persistent pattern. Consider the bazooka, for example, conceived by a captain who disregarded the skepticism of the Ordnance Department and personally constructed a prototype in his own garage. Similarly, body armor capable of effectively stopping rifle rounds originated from field modifications soldiers made to their inadequate issued vests, rather than from initial procurement specifications. The up-armored Humvees that eventually provided critical protection to convoy crews in Iraq were initially unauthorized alterations, meticulously welded together by motor pool sergeants using scavenged scrap metal and ballistic glass from damaged vehicles. In every single instance, the vital solution emerged from soldiers circumventing established regulations, driven by the stark reality that survival unequivocally outweighed mere compliance. This recurring phenomenon introduces a fundamental paradox at the very core of military innovation. Armies are, by their very nature, hierarchical institutions that thrive on standardization, strict regulations, and authorized procedures, and for entirely valid reasons. When the immense task of coordinating hundreds of thousands of personnel across multiple continents is undertaken, there is an absolute necessity for standardized equipment, predictable supply chains, and universally observed operational procedures. However, this same emphasis on standardization inadvertently generates institutional inertia, a powerful resistance to change, even when such change is desperately needed to address evolving threats. The elaborate procurement system, while ensuring every soldier receives the same reliable rifle, simultaneously dictates that any improvement to that rifle necessitates navigating years of rigorous testing, intricate approval processes, and protracted budget negotiations. Frontline soldiers, however, operate under a vastly different set of constraints and priorities. Their immediate concern is not with the intricacies of supply chain logistics or the minutiae of procurement regulations. Their paramount focus is whether their equipment functions effectively right now in the highly specific and often brutal conditions they confront on any given day. When that equipment demonstrably fails, when machine guns cannot reliably hit targets from moving jeeps, when body armor proves incapable of stopping the actual rounds being fired at them, or when vehicles lack adequate protection against the threats they are actually facing, soldiers will invariably take it upon themselves to rectify the problem. They do so by improvising solutions using whatever materials and skills are at their disposal. This is a primal survival instinct overriding a cumbersome institutional process, and it is a consistent occurrence in every armed conflict. The most astute military organizations acknowledge this inherent reality and proactively establish channels to capture these invaluable field innovations before they disseminate too far beyond official control. During World War I, the British Army maintained specialized trench workshops where soldier-invented tools and weapons could be thoroughly evaluated and, if proven effective, rapidly produced for wider distribution. Similarly, The German military in World War II actively encouraged unit-level modifications and deployed liaison officers specifically tasked with documenting successful field expedients for potential broader adoption. While these systems were certainly not flawless, they crucially recognized the undeniable truth that soldiers would innovate whether officially authorized or not. Therefore, it was far more pragmatic for the institution to harness such ingenuity rather than attempt to suppress it. Regrettably, the American military in 1945 possessed no such formalized system. This absence explains precisely why Cup S Mount spread through informal networks for months before headquarters even became aware of its existence. By the time any official evaluation commenced, hundreds of soldiers had already independently adopted the modification, relying solely on its burgeoning word-of-mouth reputation and direct observation of its tangible results. The system, in essence, operated in reverse. Widespread adoption preceded formal approval, and that approval was ultimately granted only because the modification had already become too pervasive to effectively suppress. This narrative clearly illustrates innovation occurring despite the institutional framework, rather than being facilitated by it. There lies a more profound truth in this recurring pattern concerning the actual origins of problem-solving. Raymond Cup was not a formally trained engineer, nor was he an ordnance specialist, nor was he anyone the institutional army would have officially tasked with improving weapon mounts. He was fundamentally a farm kid who possessed an innate understanding of springs and vibration, acquired through the practical experience of repairing tractors. The critical insight that ultimately resolved the problem emanated from his agricultural background, not from conventional military expertise. This phenomenon occurs constantly. Groundbreaking innovations frequently originate from individuals who apply knowledge gleaned from entirely unrelated fields, precisely because they are not constrained by preconceived notions of how things are supposed to work within a specific domain. An expert in vehicle-mounted weapons, for instance, might not consider borrowing solutions from tractor suspensions because tractors are not weapons. However, someone with practical knowledge of both tractors and weapons can forge connections that specialized experts often overlook. Modern militaries continue to grapple with this identical paradox today. The procurement system has become progressively slower and more bureaucratic, with the average development timelines for new equipment now extending to an astonishing 15 or 20 years, from the initial requirement to actual fielding. Concurrently, recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan generated urgent and immediate needs, such as improved IED protection, sophisticated counter-drone systems, and encrypted communications that reliably functioned in complex urban environments. Requirements that simply could not endure a 2-decade wait for solutions. The inevitable result was yet another wave of unauthorized field modifications, swiftly followed by frantic efforts to legitimize and mass-produce the very solutions that soldiers had already ingeniously constructed for themselves. The overarching lesson here is not that regulations are inherently flawed or that soldiers should routinely disregard established procedures. Indeed, unauthorized modifications can introduce significant dangers, create logistical nightmares within supply chains, and tragically lead to equipment failures that cost lives. Rather, the fundamental lesson is that the inherent disparity between what existing equipment is capable of doing and what soldiers genuinely require will always persist. In response, creative individuals will perpetually endeavor to bridge that gap, entirely irrespective of what regulations dictate. The critical question for military institutions, therefore, is how they choose to respond to this intrinsic creativity. Will they suppress it? Will they effectively harness it? Or will they simply pretend it isn't happening until it becomes utterly impossible to ignore? The story of Cup's Mount unequivocally proved that the latter option is entirely ineffective. Soldiers will innovate, whether they receive official authorization or not, and the most effective course of action for any institution is to recognize valuable ideas quickly enough to formalize them before they are already universally adopted by the rank and file.